in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the Church becomes a wholly horizontal phenomenon.
Nobody, not even the cardinals closest to the Curia, expected the Vatican to make such an announcement. 5 minutes before noon Rome time, the Holy See press office issued a bulletin that was so brief and understated that many assumed it was an error. His Holiness Pope Leo XIV has appointed His Eminence Robert Cardinal Sarah to a newly created position within the Holy See. Additional information will be provided later. No title, there's no description, there is no press conference. But within 5 minutes, the Catholic world was ablaze. Cardinal Sarah, the Guinean-born prelate, was known for his staunch defense of orthodoxy. The man who quietly but unmistakably disagreed with Pope Francis on everything from liturgical reform to gender ideology. The man many thought had been pushed into the background during the previous pontificate has left to give lectures in Paris and homilies in Dakar. He was now being called back, and not into silence. I'm not into ceremonial retirement. However, we are moving on to something new, something active. For years, Sarah had served as the standard-bearer for the Church's most traditional wing, a hero to those who desired Latin masses, unchanging doctrine, and theological clarity. He was also a lightning rod for progressive criticism, with some accusing him of rigidity, exclusion, and nostalgia disguised as holiness. Nonetheless, Pope Leo XIV reinstated him. Why? What could possibly motivate a new pontiff, already known for his friendly demeanor, reformist leanings, and emphasis on inclusion, to seek out a man who is frequently portrayed as his polar opposite? Theories spread quickly. Was this an attempt to appease the conservative wing of the Church? Was Leo attempting to balance his papacy with voices from the global South? Or was there a deeper reason? A strategic move that signaled redefinition rather than compromise? Whatever the response, one thing was certain. Cardinal Robert Sarah was no longer exiled. He was back. What about the role that Pope Leo had created for him? It wasn't an honorific. It was not symbolic. It was mission critical. Because while the world debates doctrine and direction, Leo XIV appears to understand what his predecessors frequently forgot. Those who resist change can shape the path forward. With Sarah's return, the stage is set for a church defined by contrast rather than conflict. For nearly a decade, Cardinal Robert Sarah represented something the Vatican didn't quite understand: unwavering conviction. Sarah's rise was rapid, beginning with her appointment by Pope Benedict XVI and continuing through Pope Francis' early years as Pope. His African ancestry, ascetic lifestyle, and strong theological foundation made him a standout in Rome, but also, eventually, a liability. By 2021, he had left his post as prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. The Vatican stated that he had reached the retirement age of 75, which is the standard for bishops and curial leaders. But everyone in the Curia knew better. He was sidelined, stated a former Vatican official. It is too clear, too rooted, too unshakable. Sarah's clashes with Francis's agenda were never broadcast. He never raised his voice or issued public rebukes. His writing, however, was sharp, poetic, and unapologetic, making it clear what he believed. He opposed communion for the divorced and remarried. He objected to the loosening of liturgical norms, calling it spiritual disfigurement. When others argued that priestly celibacy was no longer necessary, he defended it. He repeatedly warned that the Church was losing its sense of the sacred in favor of sociological relevance. His 2019 book, The Day Is Now Far Spent, was widely regarded as a veiled criticism of the Vatican's direction. It sold over 200,000 copies in multiple languages without receiving a single endorsement from a current Vatican official. In Rome, he transformed into something of a ghost. He was frequently seen at masses, dressed in his crimson cassock and kneeling in quiet prayer. He delivered lectures throughout Europe and Africa. He went to parishes on the margins. However, The phone calls from Vatican departments stopped coming. He was not invited to speak. He was not invited to advise, stated a French Monsignor. However, the pews were full when he spoke. People were eager to hear what he had to say. Nonetheless, Sarah never played the victim. In interviews, he declined to criticize Pope Francis by name. When asked about his removal, he simply smiled and said, "I serve wherever God places me." Some believed he was finished, a relic, a throwback, the last gasp of the Benedict XVI era, but others knew better. "Silence doesn't mean surrender," said a Senegalese bishop. "In Africa, we know the power of waiting," and he waited. While the church debated synods and statements, Sarah continued to do what he always did: pray, read, serve, and observe. He watched as Francis's final years were fraught with scandal, infighting, and an increasingly divided flock. He watched as voices on both sides became more agitated, louder, and less willing to listen. He watched as young seminarians became disillusioned by ambiguity and resumed secret Latin studies. Sarah was present when Pope Francis died and the doors to the conclave closed. Not campaigning, not angling, just present. Some believed he had no chance of being elected pope. He was overly controversial, too hardline. However, that may not have been his role to play, because just a few weeks later, under a new pontificate, the impossible occurred. The telephone rang. It arrived quietly. No entourage, no announcement. It's just a simple call. The phone rang at Cardinal Robert Sarah's modest residence on the outskirts of Rome, where he had lived since retirement. A small stone house filled with African iconography, well-worn theological texts, and the silence of a man who had given up expecting much from Vatican phone calls. But that morning it rang. He answered. On the other end, Pope Leo XIV. "Robert," the voice answered. Calm, familiar. "It's time we talk." The call lasted for 43 minutes. According to sources, this was not a summons, not a demand. It was an invitation. "I have been listening to the Church," Pope Leo reportedly stated, "and I believe we cannot build unity without including those who felt pushed away." Sarah initially remained silent. He held no illusions. He was knowledgeable about politics. He'd seen men cheer one year, then erase the next. But this was not flattering. This was direct, honest. The new pope praised Sarah's clarity, courage, and most importantly, his witness. "You stood your ground," Leo XIV informed him. "Now I need you to walk with me, not in the past, but into the future." Sarah was stunned. This was a pope widely regarded as a bridge builder, a centrist reformer, raised in Francis's spirit while acutely aware of the church's growing schism. Why contact the man most associated with the other side? That's when Leo clarified. "I'm not trying to silence you," he explained. "I am asking you to serve, visibly, be yourself." Then came the offer, not returning to liturgical oversight, not to be buried in an advisory position, but to lead a new office that focuses on global renewal rather than internal bureaucracy. Sarah requested time to pray. Leo said he expected nothing less. Sarah spent 5 days doing what he always did, attending Mass alone, reading scripture, and walking in the garden outside his house. He didn't speak to any reporters. We conducted no interviews. Insiders, however, say they saw something in his face that they hadn't seen in years: peace, because the Pope did not ask him to change. He was asking him to serve again, but this time on a mission that resembled a calling rather than an assignment. 5 days later, Cardinal Sarah agreed, not with conditions, not with exceptions, but in a simple line: "I've never sought titles, but if this benefits the Church, I will walk," and that is how it happened. The fiery theologian, the divisive cardinal, the so-called exile, was now quietly preparing for a role that would take him further than any curia office had ever gone, into a fractured church that desperately needed someone to remind it of what conviction looks like when it's wrapped in humility. When the Vatican finally issued the full statement, it was not buried in liturgical jargon or ambiguous language. It was bold, clear, and, for many in Rome, unprecedented. His Holiness, Pope Leo XIV, appoints His Eminence, Robert Cardinal Sarah, as Special Papal Envoy to the Global South, tasked with strengthening ties between traditional Catholic communities and the central mission of unity, evangelization, and doctrinal fidelity. The position had never existed before. There was no precedent, previous holder, or handbook. Pope Leo XIV had designed it specifically for Sarah. Within hours, Vatican correspondents were scrambling to determine what it meant. A symbolic gesture? An olive branch to the conservatives? Or is it something deeper? Because while the title seemed ceremonial, insiders revealed that the authority it conveyed was very real. Sarah would not report to the Secretary of State. He would report directly to the Pope. His mandate included the following: representing the Vatican in episcopal negotiations through Africa, Asia, and Latin America, advising bishops' conferences on the connection between liturgical tradition and contemporary pastoral care, serving as a liaison for regions dealing with increasing secularism, persecution, and internal division. Most importantly, disenfranchised traditional Catholic communities must be reintegrated into the Church's global mission. In short, Cardinal Sarah was not being housed in a museum. He was being deployed to the front lines. No one was prepared for it. Within the Curia, the move sparked surprise and even confusion. One Vatican diplomat reportedly stated, "It's as if the Pope reached into the past to build the future." However, not everyone was cynical. A young Nigerian priest working in the Congregation for Bishops smiled as he read the memo. "This is not politics," he stated. "It's personal. Leo understands where the faith is growing, and he knows Sarah speaks the language of growth. Indeed, the numbers do not lie." Over the last 2 decades, the Global South, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, has seen the fastest growth of Catholicism in the world. Martyrs, missionaries, and movements are driving the Church's expansion there, rather than marketing campaigns. Nonetheless, many of these regions feel cut off from Rome, alienated by Western-centric debates about synodality, gender, and liturgical experimentation. Sarah represents a rare fusion of African spirituality and Roman orthodoxy, unwavering faith, and a complete familiarity with the suffering Church. The reaction outside of Europe was immediate. Bells rang at Kinshasa's St. Charles Lwanga Cathedral. In Cebu, Filipino seminarians shared Sarah's quote, "The West is dying because it has forgotten how to kneel." Even Sarah's critics took notice. A Jesuit theologian who once disagreed with him at a liturgical conference wrote in a blog post, "Whether you admire or oppose him, you must now deal with him. The Pope chose engagement over exile. That explains everything." Sarah accepted the appointment in a brief letter once she returned to Rome. There's no fanfare. There is no press event. Just these words: "I'll go wherever the Church sends me, and I will not speak of ideology, but of the gospel." So the man once branded as too rigid for modern Catholicism was sent, not to defend the past, but walk ahead of it. The Vatican is no stranger to internal tremors. However, few appointments in recent years have caused such distinct and divisive shockwaves through its corridors as Cardinal Robert Sarah's return. Some consider it the first mistake of Pope Leo XIV's young pontificate. To others, it was his most daring yet. The reaction behind Vatican walls came in waves: surprise, skepticism, and then a gradually rising realization. This is more than just a gesture. This is strategy. The dicastery for the doctrine of the faith received mixed responses. A senior official with close ties to the Francis administration reportedly sighed. This man wanted to restore the Latin Mass everywhere. Are we now empowering him again? However, another junior official speaking on background disagreed. It's not about empowering him. It's about listening to what half of the Church has been saying and giving them a voice that won't destroy the house. Indeed, Pope Leo XIV had not appointed Sarah as head of a curial department, nor had he placed him in charge of liturgy or doctrine. Instead, he gave him something more dangerous: a voice and a mission outside the bureaucracy. The Vatican press corps coverage was equally polarized. Progressive Catholic publications ran op-ed pieces warning of creeping restorationism and the rehabilitation of hardliners. One headline read, "The return of rigor." However, traditionalist platforms erupted in celebration. The most popular image on Catholic Twitter featured Pope Leo XIV in white, smiling softly, and Cardinal Sarah in red, eyes lowered, holding a breviary. The caption reads, "There are two pillars, one church." Some Vatican watchers feared that this would spark a new ideological battle, Francis versus Benedict, but this time as Leo versus Sarah. However, insiders say Leo anticipated and welcomed the tension. "He's not building camps," said one Curia employee. "He is building corridors between voices that had forgotten how to communicate with one another." Indeed, the Pope reportedly informed his advisors, "If you silence every voice that questions you, you will end up alone, and alone is not a place for Peter's successor." And Cardinal Sarah? He made no disparaging remarks. There is no press conference. When asked by a journalist whether he saw his role as a comeback, he responded, "This is not a return. I've never left. I was simply praying. Now I am walking." Even his detractors were taken aback by his firm but not fiery tone, because regardless of his previous disagreements with Francis's agenda, Sarah would not be brought back to fight. He was being brought back as a witness. And in a Vatican more accustomed to subtle maneuvering and cautious messaging, the clarity of Leo's move said more than any encyclical. The Church cannot be whole if it amputates her prophets. It was not held in Rome, but rather Nairobi, a brief press conference inside the Archbishop's residence. No velvet curtains, no gold-trimmed thrones, a long table, a few microphones, and Cardinal Robert Sarah, who sat in silence until the cameras stopped clicking. He wore no spectacles, no political grin, only his red mozzetta and a rosary encircled his fingers. Then he spoke, not with fire, with finality. "I serve, I don't seek." With those 6 words, Cardinal Sarah silenced an entire news cycle. There was no mention of conflict, no mention of former popes, rival factions, or liturgical wars. When asked directly about his previous clashes with Vatican leadership, Sarah simply replied, "I'm not here to debate history. I'm here to bring Christ to the poor, broken, and faithful who feel forgotten." He confirmed his new title, Special Papal Envoy to the Global South, and detailed his upcoming itinerary, which includes Burkina Faso, Colombia, the Philippines, South Sudan, and a return to Europe to listen, not to lecture. But the true highlight of the event came when a Kenyan reporter asked him, "What is your message to Catholics who are torn between tradition and change?" Sarah did not flinch. Truth does not change. However, each generation requires a unique approach to reaching hearts. Some people call me rigid. I consider myself rooted. I don't mind change when it comes from prayer. I am afraid of panic-induced change. Another journalist inquired about his thoughts on the rumors, which suggested that he was a checkmate move by Leo XIV to appease the conservative base. Sarah replied with a slow, measured smile. "A bishop isn't just a piece on the board. He serves souls." He thanked the Pope for his trust. He thanked his African brethren for their testimony. And he concluded with words that echoed far beyond Nairobi. "We aren't supposed to be left or right. We are supposed to be holy. If I speak, it will not be for applause. If I walk, it is not to gain power. I go where the shepherd sends me, to find the sheep who have given up believing anyone is coming." He stood up, refused to shake hands, and walked out on his own, not with headlines following him, but with gravity, whether the world loves or hates him. Cardinal Sarah had returned, not to reclaim a platform, but to lift a cross. In Rome, it's dubbed a masterstroke, not because it was flashy, not because it was expected. However, it shifted the center of gravity without firing a single shot. When Pope Leo XIV appointed Cardinal Sarah as Special Envoy to the Global South, he did not simply resurrect a dormant prelate. He changed the terms of engagement in the Church. Over the last decade, Catholicism has been gripped by a false binary. You are either Francis or Benedict, progressive or traditional, compassionate or dogmatic. Pope Leo has now said, "No, you can be both. You must be both." To heal this Church, the voices that once stood across the aisle must now walk in the same direction. Leo XIV did something radical when he called Cardinal Sarah to serve in the mission fields rather than Rome. He gave tradition a task rather than a throne. He did not make Sarah the guardian of liturgy or doctrine. He didn't use him against progressives. He sent him to where the Church is growing the fastest and breaking the deepest, with a mandate to unify rather than rebuke. One Vatican watcher said it perfectly. Francis showed the world compassion. Benedict defended the truth. Leo is attempting to marry them, and Sarah has now joined that union. This does not mark the end of the Church's division. It is not a magical healing, but it is a signal from the very top that the old walls are falling down, not by tearing them up, however, by inviting both builders and critics to rebuild together. And for a Church battered by scandal, ideology, and attrition, that message may be the first indication of something it hasn't felt in years: hope. Because if Cardinal Robert Sarah can rediscover his place, not in opposition but in mission, then perhaps the Church can too.